Hello from the dung heap, everybody. These are my friends. A lot of
Hi,
them.
friends.
There he is. Hi, sweetie.
Hello. Good morning, everybody.
And we're live. Hello. SPTV. Hello. Hi, everybody. Hello. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about this stream. I've been looking forward to it. And we have our good friend, Mark Turi, here today. And, I hope he doesn't mind me saying he's one of the smartest guys I know. Super fascinating. I love to pick his brain about all kinds of academic things, all things religion and history. So without further ado, we have our friend here, Mark Turi. Hey there, friend. Good to
Hello,
see you.
everyone. Hi.
Hi.
Uh,
Welcome back to
always
the
good.
dung heap.
Yeah, well, it's always nice to get good comments because I have made a lot of enemies in my past, so it's nice
Oh,
to
I
have
can't
friends.
imagine that. Well,
Oh
Scientology.
no, I have, but yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Well, first of all, I'd like to start by pulling up your channel.
Thank you
It's
so much.
is it at Mark Tory? Is it 123? I can't read.
One, two,
Okay.
three. Yeah,
Yeah.
at Mark
Yep.
Turi, 1, 2, 3.
And you should put the link in the chat. Head on over to his channel and show him some love. Give him a subscribe and a like. And you're also streaming this to your channel as well, right?
That's correct. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. So you can describe what you're going to talk about better than me, but I asked you if we could maybe start at the very beginning, at the beginning of the origins of Judeo-Christian roots. And
Sure.
I listened to a little bit of your talk. There's a whole PowerPoint presentation that you have on your channel on this very topic. It's very fascinating. I got to go back and listen to the rest of it. But I already saw and heard some things that I was like, this is interesting because this is not what I learned as a child and as a young adult. So
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, I really want to kind of go to like the um origination of really what Judaism is. So for those who may not even know or know me, that well. Now, I used to be a Scientologist, and I was in Scientology for 3 years. If you do go to my channel, you will know that I did quite a number of videos with our very, very dear late friend Doug Scott Kramer about
That's how I
how
was
before
introduced to you. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so before Scientology, I discovered a lot of different religions. After Scientology, I discovered a lot of different religions. But as an adult, and these are all personal things because I get a lot of questions of, why did you do all these different things? And then now, you are one way, why not the other way? And just to be very brief, because it's obviously a lot of, complicated, it's just that I was not raised Jewish. I was not raised with any religion, but I have Jewish family. And as an adult, my parents let me discover who I was. We'd never had any formal religious sort of setting. And so just as an adult, I've become more closer with my Jewish heritage. It's obviously not a judgment on anyone else, people who want to be religious or part of another religion, or if you don't have any other, any religion, it's totally fine and totally fair. I'm just, interested in that area. In addition to that, I'm doing my master's degree and I'm writing my thesis at the moment on Jewish history in Central Eastern Europe. And I've
Mhm.
been looking a lot about discrimination, systemic discrimination, institutional discrimination, anti Semitism from the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's a lot of stuff, but essentially it's become my passion, and it's just become like part of what I like doing and like talking about. And we are a very small group. I don't think people really know that, even though we're a very ancient religion and an ancient culture, there's only
Mhm.
16 million Jewish people worldwide.
Really?
That's exactly the same that there was in 1939. It's the same. Okay.
Oh.
And so, like, we're a small group of people. We have our own distinctive culture and religion. In addition to that, I did grow up with Christian family, and I grew up around Muslim people. And sometimes there's just some stuff that they share in their stories that we don't. And so that's why I kind of like just coming in and be like, hey, I'm not saying any other previous story is wrong, but let's just add some more knowledge and add some more perspectives to what we already know, and then we can just learn and be curious, because that's really, to me, what my channel is, and what this channel is education, learning, discussing, talking about people, and not being, judgmental. So that's really kind of where
Yeah.
I want to
Can
start.
I
And
ask
you know, I
Yeah,
am
can I ask
Jewish, I
you
am
to just
practicing.
Oh, go
So
ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
think we have
that's
a
all I
little bit
want
of
to
a
say.
delay because you're all the way in Budapest,
Okay.
so I think we have a little bit of a
Yeah.
delay. So I'll try to be
All good, all
mindful
good.
of that myself, because I talk a lot. I One thing I thought was really
I did too.
fascinating that you prefaced your talk with, is the idea of, if you can summarize the idea of how the Jewish people, it's an ethnicity, it's also there's a religion attached to it, but it doesn't always, it's not always interchangeable. And also how some religions are, I think you called it something like universalizing, and some are ethnic
Exactly.
religions and are more of a closed religion based
Mhm.
on your ethnicity. If you could just speak to that a little bit, because I thought that was really fascinating. It was kind of a good lead into this whole talk of the originations of Judaism and Jewish
Of course.
descent.
So a big shout out to how Marilyn and I met with the Nerdy Bunch back a couple of years back. I
Yeah.
did do a PowerPoint uh, on basically the contemporary religious studies and sort of what that means. So the academic study of religion, and so forth. And one of the things I learned, because I did take religious studies courses when I was in college and university. So that's another thing that I really like learning about, is other religions, not just my own. And one of the things I learned was that, yeah, there's multiple different types of religions, but how many of them tend to be grouped in this particular sense is a universalizing religion is a religion that essentially goes out to convert other people. And then there's an ethnic religion, and they are two very different things, because in an ethnic religion, you're usually born into it, and they usually don't look for converts. And I know that that can seem a little strange, especially to those who have grown up in a universalizing religion, because there are more people in universalizing religions. So, for example, Roman Catholicism, most Protestant groups, there's a difference on Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox Christianity. They
Hmm.
kind of toe the line. But if you grew up in a church that has missionaries, or in Islam, they have missionaries, although even in Islam, they have a group called the Ismailis, which is still crosses the line. But
Hmm.
you get the idea that, like, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity, your language, your history, your culture, the gospel or the teachings, it supersedes everything. So you
Right.
take on that faith, you get saved, and that's number one. But in an ethnic religion, you're born into it. It could be because your mother is born to that religion, or your father is born to that religion. And there could be some religions where you cannot convert. Whereas in Judaism, you can convert. It's just a little bit of a longer process. So I gave you the
Yeah.
example back then of the Zoroastrian religion, which is an ancient Persian religion that goes back before Judaism. And you're born into that faith if your mother is a Zoroastrian, but people cannot convert. So
Okay.
that's actually something that's a possibility as well. So this is when we're talking about
Hmm.
religion, we're talking about a lot of different stuff, not just one or two different religions, but a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, I know very few people that have converted to Judaism that aren't, ethnically from Jewish descent, and they call themselves Jewish. Like, I'm Jewish now. And so what do you think about that? Like, is that accurate, or is it more like they converted to Judaism, that were therefore they are what
For
they
me,
believe?
I accept everybody. Like, that's another thing
So
where we
they are
have
considered Jewish, even though.
denominational
Hmm.
yeah, we have denominational divides, and the
Yeah.
strongest one is Orthodox. I'm not
Hmm.
Orthodox. Orthodox tend to be more dogmatic and in some cases fundamentalist. They would say that you have to be born to a Jewish mother, which is the only tenet to being Jewish, or of course you
Hmm.
convert, but they would say only if you convert in an Orthodox rabbi. But of course, there's dozens upon dozens of different versions. So even if you, like, let's say, I don't know, convert to Hasidic, someone will tell you you're not really Jewish because you should have, converted to their brand. So
Right.
what I like to say
Yeah.
is
It's
just,
the same thing in
yeah, okay,
Christianity. Yeah, that happens too.
exactly. You're not.
Hmm.
It's called an old no true Scotsman fallacy.
Hmm.
So you guys can look that up, but it's a lot of that in the Orthodox community. What I say is, yeah, if you're born to a Jewish mother, then you're Jewish, regardless of your faith. You could then convert to be a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever, but you still are ethnically Jewish. However, if you convert to me, I don't care where you convert, conservative Judaism, Orthodox,
Right.
Reform, whatever. And so, yeah, after that point, you're Jewish. And so you might, like in my case, for example, I have Jewish background, like Jewish heritage, but because there was some questions on my mom's side of the family, somebody in one of her grandparents was Jewish. I don't know which one, so I eventually did go through a conversion process. But even so, still, uh, quite quite a little bit of me is attached to two different Jewish communities, which we can get to afterwards. But
Hmm.
regardless, as I say, it doesn't really matter. I've also been mostly practicing Judaism on and off since I was an adult because I could do that. So yeah, I'm
Right.
just more inclusive. I don't care what God forbid someone converts to Reform Judaism. Someone who's Orthodox is going to laugh that off. I don't agree with that. So
Right.
that's my
And just
interpretation.
just for those watching and those on the replay, we kind of discussed ahead of time. We're going to
Yeah.
focus on the roots of Judeo Christian roots or whatever, but starting with the Jewish people. We're not going to be talking about the Gaza Strip or Riviera. No, no, I saw somebody else,
Yeah.
which is valid question, but we're gonna
I know.
kind of
I
stay
know.
away from politics and present day unrest. There's enough of that. So I think we're starting this so we can kind of have a springboard of discussion about eventually, right, about Christianity and those roots and different denominations and sects and very like various cults that kind of came out of that as well. So I just wanted to kind of
Yeah.
give that little bit of disclaimer.
Exactly. That to me is just briefly, because I know people will always say, just give a couple words on it. I'm just going to be brief to say tragedy is tragedy, no matter
Yeah,
who's doing it or what. I have friends and family that live in Israel. I've been there, so I have a connection. But that doesn't mean that I don't like other people. I can't like other people.
yeah,
In the end, we're all human. So hopefully there'll be some peaceful resolution, and that to me
yeah,
is the best way. Just that's it.
yeah,
What can I say? I'm
yeah,
here in Budapest. You're in America. We kind of feel helpless and kind of maybe, that we can't really do much because there's a lot of, things going on. But like, we're all, in the end, we're all human, and we have to admit that we don't have control of everything as well. So
yeah.
it's very sad,
Absolutely,
but it's part of life.
absolutely.
So
Yeah,
anyway, but yeah, I guess if we're going to start with like the absolute, ground zero, so to speak, or the genesis of Judaism, it's something that we have to go back even further, to even before there is Judaism. So when I was an undergrad, I took a course, an anthropology course that sort of was, well, interdisciplinary between anthropology and history, specifically on diaspora communities. And the Jewish people have the largest and one of the largest and also one of the longest diaspora communities in human history. So
Can you
basically,
explain what that means?
and diaspora just means when a community is forced out of their indigenous land and they're forced to migrate somewhere else. So, for example, today there's a large Syrian diaspora in Canada and America because of the Syrian civil war. When the Rwandan war happened in the 90s, I remember my high school and my public school got Rwandan refugees. That's a diaspora.
Okay.
So the Jewish people from the time of and I'll get into this in a moment, the first temple was destroyed until 1948. We were the longest the longest diaspora community in human history. So the point being that when I took this course on diaspora, what we learned was that uh, the 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 point and the people that are very, very important to the story are called the Phoenicians. So we have to start with the Phoenician
Mhm.
peoples. So some people probably know that from ancient history. If you've
Yep.
studied ancient Rome, ancient Greece, they were a people groups that predated a lot of these different civilizations. So this collective group known as the Phoenicians had a lot of different subgroups. Some of them are extinct, like for example, the ancient Egyptians of the pharaohs and so forth. They were a Phoenician peoples. The Carthaginians. So if you studied Hannibal and the craziness of putting freaking elephants into the Alps, like that guy,
Mhm.
he was also a Phoenician. But today, you'll know there's a group of people called the Berber who live in Morocco and Algeria. They descend from Phoenicians, but so do the Semitic people, who are the Arab people and Arabic speakers, and the Hebrew people, Jewish people. So we all kind of descend from this one civilization that is one of the first people groups in North Africa. And then a lot of them migrated, of course, through the Sinai Peninsula into an area that we refer to as the Levant or the Levant. It depends on your accent. I'll probably just be calling it the Levant. And today, the Levant is basically modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and the western part of Syria. But it also extends a little further into the Sinai Peninsula. So that's the piece of land that Egypt owns that's actually in the Middle East. So it's east of the Suez Canal. And then
Okay.
also parts of the northern part of Saudi Arabia and even parts of today Turkey and Iraq. So it's like a pretty large, substantial territory, because this is where the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians, the
Mhm.
Assyrians, the Babylonians, they all came from here. And some of them were Semitic people, some of them obviously were
And
not.
that's
But that
Northern Africa? That's
that's so the Phoenicians come from North Africa, but then
okay.
they migrated into the eastern Mediterranean.
Okay.
So that's the Levant. The Levant is the eastern part of the Mediterranean.
Okay, where is Mount Sinai if it exists? I don't know. Like I just remember hearing that like Sermon on the Mount and Mount Sinai and all that. Like is that in existence now?
So, you know what? I don't know. That's a very, very good
The
question.
Bible thing,
It
yeah.
would probably be today. It would probably be today, probably in Israel or maybe the
Mhm.
Palestinian territory. But yeah, it would have been around there. So that's the Levant essentially. So if you look that up, so the Phoenician peoples they moved beyond the Nile and they migrated into the Levant area, and of course they were polytheists. So the ancient Berbers before they became Muslim, the Carthaginians and the ancient Egyptians had their own gods.
Yeah.
And then when the Phoenician people came into the Levant, they became the Canaanite peoples. So that's
Mhm.
another group of people that I'm sure, if you read the Bible, I have a couple
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
My
Me
my
too.
half of the Bible, which is
Okay.
the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, but yeah, and
I don't
that's
mean to
actually
stop you.
another group.
I'm just jotting things down. I'm like thinking of so many questions. So you're mentioning several, I don't know if they're all separate or they're the same, but you're saying about the Semitism, about Semites, the Hebrew people, and the Canaanites. Like what are the difference of those different ethnicities of Jewish people, or are they just interchangeable um words, like, I don't know.
Well,
And then I'm thinking
they
of
were
like the 12
Phoenician.
tribe of Israel and all that. Like, I don't know how that
Yeah.
all fits together.
So the first group of people were the Phoenicians.
Okay.
Then the Phoenicians evolve into smaller groups, which were the Berbers, the Carthaginians, the Egyptians, and the Canaanites.
Okay.
From the Canaanites, who settled in the Levant, they would
Mm-hmm.
then become the Semitic peoples, and they would then become the Hebrews. So one thing to note is I think in the Bible it says that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, are not the same as the Canaanites. But
Mm-hmm.
according to DNA and anthropology, we were one of many groups of Canaanites in the ancient Levant. And the difference between us and the other groups was that we decided to become monotheists, whereas all of the other
Okay.
groups, like the Moabs and all these other people,
Yep.
they
Yep.
stayed polytheistic.
Wow. Okay. So the Semites came from the Canaanites and not the other way around.
That's correct.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
the
Okay.
Canaanites were first. Yeah,
So I'm
Canaanites are
gonna.
first.
Can I just go on a side thing here?
Yeah,
All right.
go ahead. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Because this is the stuff I was thinking of when I was listening to your talk, your video. All right. So what I was taught, a little bit far fetched, but what I was taught is that, okay, so back in Noah days, right? So this is probably before any of this, supposedly, the era of the whole, beginnings of it all, right? This is what I was taught is that the three sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay,
Mhm,
that's what I was taught. And so Shem was the originator, the father of the Semites, because Shem,
mhm.
them, I don't know. I don't know how they got Semites out of Shem, but sort of sounds like it. And that evolved into the Jewish people. I'm just saying this is what I was taught. Um, Ham was the southern, below the equator, Africa, Australia, all the natives from that area. I don't know what Asia is supposed to be, but that Japheth was the northern hemisphere of like Europe and all those. So that's what we were taught. So I'm glad to know that that's, not really where the word Semite came from, right? It was more from the Canaanites, because the
Yeah,
Canaanites supposedly came
again,
after.
well, the Canaanites were first. So the thing
Right.
is, the one thing to note as well is if you're into linguistics and the history of languages like I am, we all have different language
I'm gonna need a
families,
flowchart.
okay? And that's right, yeah. Um,
You see?
but different languages will have different language families. So the Phoenician languages, as I mentioned, the Berbers, Carthaginians, Egyptians, Canaanites, Hebrews, Arabs, all of that is called Afro-Asiatic. So Afro meaning Africa,
Okay.
Asiatic meaning Asia, right?
Asia.
West
Mhm.
Asia. So all of them, we all have a common ancestor. So Arabs, there's also a group of people in Niger, in northern Nigeria, called the Hausa people. They also speak an Afro-Asiatic language, and the Somalis speak an Somali that is an Afro-Asiatic language. So the one thing to note is, okay, the story of the three sons is an allegory. That reminds me of the Tower of Babel and so
Yeah.
forth, where people are trying to think of these different peoples and then they're relaying it back to what they know and they're making it part of these three sons. I've forgotten that, as you mentioned. As you were saying it, it kind of triggered my memory. But that might have not literally
Yeah.
happened. But
For
all of
anyone
those
who's
people
not
groups
familiar with
have
that
linguistic,
story,
yeah.
the story of the Tower of Babel, whichever. I like to say Babel because it kind of brings in the whole language kind of thing. But
That's
this
right.
is what I was taught is that there was a universal language and the world, at that point, it was just the world was just that area. We didn't have North and South America and all that, right? So they all spoke the same language. Now, as human nature would have it, the fallen nature of man, that they started to get prideful. And because they could all speak the same language, they decided to build a tower up to God. And God was like, I'm not having that. So then he came down and he just scribbled all the languages, and then nobody could understand what anybody was saying. And then there goes the Tower of Babel, or Babel,
Right.
because it just started babbling in different tongues.
But of course, listen, in one sense, like what's interesting about that is, if there was a Shem, uh, all the Semitic people would be descended from him, which means that they have a common ancestor. It's obviously, you could say metaphorical or whatever, allegorical. But again, really, basically, these people groups come from the Phoenician peoples, and they are kind of like the grandfathers of Jews and Arabs and Houses and Berbers and so on and so on and so on. So anytime you see anything with an Afro-Asiatic language, which again is common through the Middle East and parts of North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, their linguistic roots come all the way back basically to the Phoenician peoples, although they weren't the only peoples, but they were the most important, because again, the ancient Egyptians and the Carthaginians stemmed out of them, and they had massively amazing civilizations for quite a while, and they were very technological, like Carthage especially. So until of course they were destroyed by the Romans for the most part, or the Greeks or whatever. But yeah, that's sort of where everything sort of starts, and that's going back a couple thousand years before Common Era as well. So most of it's relied on archaeology, and also some anthropological research and DNA as well. DNA and genetics has mapped a lot of ancient people groups, and so there's always a grain of salt here and there. But as far as it looks, anyone who's from the Levant will have its genetic and linguistic roots traced back to those Phoenicians. So at least that's that's part of it.
This is so fascinating because it actually makes some sense. Because we were just taught the Bible said it, God said it, I believe it, that's the end of it. And a lot of it didn't make sense. But the whole Babel thing, I mean, that was like gospel truth. And so I'd ask questions and be like, don't ask questions. But I guess a lot of religions are fundamental religions, which I would put Scientology in with that as well, to mention that. You had the source, in our case, it was the Bible, it was the the canonized versions that we were allowed to read and all that. And so even though there seemed to be some contradictions, at least what I could see, or things that were awfully far-fetched that I asked questions about, like the Semites, I was like, wait a minute, that didn't make any sense. But yeah, so it's good to ask questions. I mean, I'm a little late to the party here, but I'm glad to know some of the real
the other thing about that is, like the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Canaanites, I don't think there's much record as to how much of their own languages they would have understood. So in the ancient world, if somebody just didn't speak another language than you, or you didn't understand their language, you probably just thought that they were completely from a different world, because they didn't have the the resources that we do now to link all of these. Well, they didn't have the idea that things had a common ancestor, like species, like languages. They didn't have that. There wasn't any modern science in the ancient world. They had their own version of sciences. They did engineering and so forth, but they didn't have our version. And then the other thing was, if they just said, well, like I don't know if the ancient Canaanites and the ancient Egyptians, let's say, could even understand their own language. So from their point of view, they would have just said, oh, well, we're different. And then if someone's different, they tend to be feared more than they are accepted. That's a very natural sort of human thing in history, is to fear the other. Whereas if somebody sort of sounded similar, they might be able to warm up to them and trade with them. So again, that's another question that I particularly as an individual don't know. I'm sure there's probably work on this that's been done. I'm just unaware of it. So you do have to, we do have to understand we're dealing with ancient peoples too. It's very tough.
So how much of I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but how much of, let's say, the book of Exodus? I know that scholars and probably most Jews don't really take everything literal, but that is part of the Judaism, right? To the what they call it, the Pentateuch, Pentateuch. What do they call that? The first 4 books of the Bible with the law of Moses and all that, and the story of
The
Moses,
first,
and the pyramids and the plagues
yeah,
and all that. Like, where does all that enter into history, and how much of it is really adopted by the Jewish people and by the religion itself?
yeah.
Is that
So that's the Torah, which is the first 5 books of
oh,
Moses,
Torah? Okay.
and in the Torah, it really
Hmm.
depends on the
Yeah,
movement
I
or
heard different. Like
denomination.
they called it different
Yeah,
things in my
yeah.
church. I don't know why.
So,
Yeah.
we have a spectrum, like some more, I would say, and we could get into the specifics of denominations, like in a because that takes us to another thing. But let's just say this: if someone is in the most liberal branch of Judaism, which is called Reform, they would tend to say that while the Torah has a deeply rooted meaning for history and culture, that it's ultimately imperfect and was written by people, and so there is a level of skepticism and biblical criticism that's applied to the Torah. On the
Really.
opposite side, which is very general, someone who's orthodox might believe more in its literalness, although that will depend on the individual and it'll depend on the synagogue. But they tend to believe that, like Moses literally received the Torah and the commandments from God on Mount Sinai. And then in the middle is the conservative movement, which I belong to. And I sort of surmise it as, I think ultimately these stories were first told in an oral tradition because there's
Hmm.
evidence of that. They were told around campfires and whatever. And then later they were written down. And ultimately, I think the people who wrote them, again, were human. So it's not perfect. But I think that they were maybe inspired, um, from something that they might have thought was higher than themselves, in the sense of
Right.
a higher culture or a higher purpose or whatever. So I tend to take the middle of the road thing. I still think it's imperfect. What's interesting though is that it's very difficult to say one way or the other, to say that the Bible is 100% accurate all the time, every time, without question. And then people who say the Bible is full of shit 100% of the time because it's
Right.
all BS and whatever. That actually isn't necessarily true, because there are certain things, depending on the story, that there actually might be evidence for, but a lot of it is wrapped up in a lot of allegory. So it's
Right.
really tough. So, for example, when we talk about things like the temples, they talk about temples and things like this in the Old Testament, or we call it the Hebrew Bible. Those temples existed. We do have archaeological evidence. There's some evidence of the rituals that went in there, but like, how elaborate is it? It's anyone's guess. Was there a flood? Noah's flood? I mentioned this actually on Sunday, because on my channel we talked about biblical criticism and biblical literalism, which I also talked about with you last time, Marilyn.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
I always like to use the story of Noah because, like, was it a worldwide flood? Well, even if there was a flood, it probably wasn't worldwide. How do you get 2 of every animal on one boat? What happens to the marsupials? We can easily debunk some of those things, but that might not even have been the point of that story. It's just that certain people and certain movements within the past only couple hundred years have irked certain groups towards that very strong literal interpretation of the Bible, whereas a lot of people throughout history have taken it more allegorical. And so it's really difficult. Okay, so to say it's 100% true or 100% false is actually not true. You can say it, to you it's true, or to you it's false, and
Right.
have an experience about it. But there are certain things, like I always go back to, was there a literal or a historical Abraham or Moses? I don't know. Certainly, there doesn't seem to be much evidence, but you know what? It doesn't matter to me, because
Oh,
we
my
still have this
pearls.
thing called Judaism. I know, but we still have this thing called Judaism regardless. We still have a set of
Right.
traditions. We still have a culture. Like, it's still survived over 5,000 years. So what does it matter if there was a real person
Right.
or not? I understand that might be the breaking point for some people, but there's something bigger going on too, which is that we still have an institution and a culture. Like, it doesn't always have to be literal, and then it
Yeah.
doesn't always have to be so non-literal. There, you can
Mm.
kind of, look at it from different perspectives, and that's just my
Yeah.
opinion. But
Yeah, I remember, the other stream that we did, well, we've done several together, but the one before this one, we talked about the similarities of different origin stories of different
yeah,
religions, and also I mean I was shocked to hear like there was other traditions and other stories coming,
mhm,
even like ancient, even more ancient than Christianity or the Bible or the Torah. Um, there was supposedly a great flood. There was, possibly a virgin birth and all that. So there's nothing new
mhm,
under the sun, as it says in Ecclesiastes, right? So I was like, oh my God, like even now, because I was so immersed in it for so many years that it's like I'm waiting for the lightning bolt, be like, oh my God, it's
yeah,
allegorical. What? Oh, there might not have been an Abraham. What? Like, oh wait,
uh,
other religions had similar stories. Oh my God,
yeah,
like blasphemy, right? But in some ways, it almost gives me like a comfort too, because
that's right.
maybe it's not so cut and dry.
Yeah,
Maybe God really isn't a big meanie with a hammer in the sky and just being like, I'm going to just destroy everything and send a rainbow and be like, yeah, I promise I won't destroy it with flood again, but fire still on the table, you
right.
know?
Well, again, if we go back, I remember saying, if we go back to the Zoroastrian religion, that's where the resurrection of the dead comes from. It doesn't come from Judaism. It doesn't come from
Mm,
Christianity. It comes from Zoroastrianism.
mm,
There were Egyptian gods. There were Canaanite gods that rose from the dead in 3 days. Even in Judaism, gosh, what was I thinking of? Anyway, I've forgotten now. My yeah, but they at least the religions that grew out of the Middle East, right? When we go to India, it's a lot different, but there are lots of different things where, yeah, there's probably I think the first man in Egypt has a very similar name to Adam. So again, that to me would be a good thing for like religious teachers, like and religious clergy, because a lot, and this is another caveat, a lot of it is how you learn something. So there are churches and synagogues and religious organizations worldwide that actually don't teach the biblical literalism. They teach a different interpretation. And so that's why sometimes I think people have a disservice when they teach their children to be good, and like I call it God as the third parent
mhm.
phenomenon,
Oh yeah.
because you want your kids to do good, so you try to scare them. And
Like
how do you
Santa Claus, but only meaner.
Yeah, and so then you omit things like, hey, maybe the first man came from Egypt, but like at the same time, if we look back to the history of storytelling, that's everyone. There's a source for everything, and so then it doesn't become as upsetting when you lay the foundation first. So if
Right.
you're in a biblical fundamentalist religion that's only going to be 200 or 300 years old, by the way, because people in the ancient days and even in the Middle Ages did not take the Bible as literally, like young earth creationism is maybe 300 years old. So that's why most churches, they don't know this, but they need to know this. At the same time, if you grew up in a church that was like, hey, here are some stories, we find them helpful, maybe they'll find you helpful. And sure, maybe some of these stories were, written in ancient and different, from the Zoroastrians or from the Egyptians. You tend to find, even if people reject or take their religion, you find that they're not as traumatized, and that's a good thing. So
Yeah.
I certainly was raised in that way. If I were to talk about religion with my parents or whatever, they always had a very liberal and very non-literal interpretation.
Mm,
They believed very strongly in what they believed in, and that's a separate issue. But the Bible didn't need to be word for word literal in order
yeah.
for someone to have an interpretation or a faith or a belief. And I think it does children and then later adults a disservice
Yeah.
to hide those things from them when you should be introducing them. Like, okay, yeah, Adam might have been an inspiration from Egypt, and the
Hmm.
Jesus, they talk about a virgin. Well, it could be interpreted as a virgin or a little girl, depending on the translation. Again, just teach your kids this stuff. Like it,
Mhm.
I don't know why in the past we weren't doing it, but I think it just, it just makes for a better discourse. Anyway, I'm not
Yeah,
a parent,
well,
so
from
I don't
my
want to single explain.
no, it's good, like, from no, from my background, it was I mean, I can kinda tell you the, where the wavelength that, my teachers, my ministers, elders, all that, my parents, my adoptive parents, what where they were coming from was there's this whole thing of this chosen, very, I would say elitist, that
Yeah.
uh, mindset that comes from like, oh, we have the truth and everything is literal. Everything is,
Yeah.
getting back to the fundamentals. And there's a pride kind of attached to that was like, well, we have the truth and these
Mhm.
intellectuals are worshiping, like Baal and all these idols of the mind and all that, and they used to call
Mhm.
it like Neboism and all this stuff. And so it's more of like faith is the like belief in things not seen, right? So basically it uses fear and control to tell you, okay, you if you are want to be on fire for God, if you want God to look at you as a faithful servant, then you need to be hot or cold, right, instead of lukewarm.
Mhm.
So those types of things of like saying, okay, maybe this isn't 100% true, maybe it's a allegorical, or it's an essence of, or it's something that's left to interpretation. No, 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 no. That just
Mhm.
was not a thing. And I think that, yeah, it was very patriarchal. It was just all the things where you couldn't question. And now it's like, it's nice to be able to question things and be like, okay, really, there's evidence of that, but not of this. And yeah, so that's why I kind of want to sort it out a little bit now that I'm grown up a little bit, a
Yeah.
little bit.
And again, you're hard pressed to find any story on Earth that has an absolute 100% origination, because people are inspired by other people. Now, we don't know some of the original sources of some of the stuff, like,
Yeah.
from where did the Zoroastrians get resurrection of the dead? Okay, maybe somebody came up with it, but it's likely that it could have come from someone else, through an oral tradition that
Mhm.
predated, and then that person picked it up and picked it up. So, like, it's very difficult to find who is the absolute first person that said a story or something. And it's because of how we are as human beings, even before the time we're talking about, which is, 5,000 years ago. Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. Human
Right.
language has been around for about 12,000 years. So, since we were speaking at least for 12,000 years until 5,000 years, right? That's 7,000 years of people telling stories. It's a long, complicated time. So that's why, again,
Right.
I think like, as I've learned a lot of this stuff as an adult, and which I learned some of it as a teenager and something, it lightens the blow, because it's also very traumatizing. And when people are traumatized, you tend to get into depressive ruts and sort of mental states that can take very years to get over. And I have all the sympathy in the world for people who are told one thing when they're a child, do a science class in college, it blows their mind, and then they're never
Yeah.
the same. It's like,
Yeah.
you have to soften these blows when you're a child. And again, I don't want to single splain to anybody, because I don't have kids. I don't know if I'll ever have kids, but I understand as I'm getting older how difficult it is to raise children. So I 100% understand and have sympathy that you try to speak to them. You're trying to do two things at once. You're trying to instill values, but then you have to do that in a language that they understand, so then they can make their own choices. And that is hard. And I don't think anyone has perfected it. So you're going to make mistakes along the ways. And
Right.
sometimes it's just easier to be like, no, eat your vegetables, because if you don't, you're going to rot in hell. It's like, that just seems easy to me. And you know what? That might work. And then you never know what a child remembers and gets
Yeah.
traumatized. And it's a very difficult thing because there's no rules.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, in my opinion, okay, maybe I say, hey, if I was a parent, I would do X, Y, and Z, and my children would be whatever. I'm sure it wouldn't be that way. I would make mistakes too. So again, I'm just trying to look at it from different
Yeah, and
different
and not
angles.
Not for
but
nothing, a
it's
lot of
hard.
parents, right? A lot of parents that come from those types of background where it's, they've been raised the same way, where it's like
Yeah,
this top down, God, and then the authorities and the church and all that. There's pressure on them, because I know that
yeah,
my adoptive parents had huge pressure to make sure that we toed the mark, and they believed in corporal punishment and all that. And
oh
so,
yeah,
yeah, there's all this whole hand me down kind of top down, you know, patriarchal kind of,
yeah,
very like law of Moses kind of thing. But let me ask you, because I was thinking as you were talking about the Abrahamic law
yeah.
and whatever the origins of that. How accurate, because I actually had to memorize it. Don't ask me to quote it now, but the first book of Matthew, go through the
Wow.
genealogy. Now, how accurate do you think any of those genealogies that are listed in the Bible are? Because they supposedly
Well,
trace back to,
I've
you know.
never read anything from the Christian Bible slash New
Okay.
Testament, but
Okay.
I do know that there in Genesis, there's a lot of Genesis where it's like, and this person lived to 900 years, and this person lived to 700 years.
Methuselah,
This person,
969. I remember. Yeah.
yeah. I again, it's if we're going to be literal, that's how long
Mm-hmm.
they lived for.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the
And that was
evidence of that?
before the
Um,
flood. Yeah.
yeah, it's like you can interpret that in multiple different ways. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I don't even know if there was that much accuracy in the calendar back then. I mean, we didn't really get the calendars until like the Renaissance, like, you know what I mean? So I don't know. Like, just because the Bible says somebody lived 900 and whatever years, probably they didn't live that long. They lived a different, like, it was different back then. But even if for some reason it was literal and they were going to live 1,000 years, it just doesn't, to me, doesn't prove anything either way. It's like it was written a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
The years thing, people get obsessed with this because it's very interesting. I get it. But for me, at least, it's like, okay, well, maybe they meant, maybe the word year was different. I don't know. Like, I really don't have an answer. I'm not really
Yeah,
hung
I've
up
heard
on
that
that
thing
stuff.
about
You know what I mean?
creation,
It's
about
it's one it's
creationism.
one of
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the same with creationism, right? 7 days. Well, old Earth creationists will say those were 7 periods. They weren't really
Mm-hmm.
days. Because again, if you're reading a Bible in English, you're not reading the scrolls of the Torah from
Right.
5,000 years ago.
Right.
You're reading an interpretation. So the Bible, like our Torah, was we were telling stories for thousands of years, and then scribes wrote down those stories into the books in ancient classical Hebrew, which people
Mm-hmm.
can learn how to read. It's not spoken anymore, but you can do that. Then, when Christians came around, the quote unquote New Testament was written in Greek. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the other half was written from Hebrew to Greek.
Yep.
Then it went to Latin, and then the church decided what books were going to be in the Bible, and they codified everything in Latin. Well, Latin changed. There's different kinds of Latin. Then a dude named Martin Luther came
Pig
along.
Latin. No, just kidding.
Family should have a Bible, and he standardized the German language and translated the Bible into German. Well, then King James did that with English. So then English and King James was not the same English we speak today, and on and on and on. So when something says a day, it's like that's your
Mhm.
translation. I don't understand. Like, to me, it's the way that the people would have been able to understand and consume at the time. And so, as a historian, this is where I'm saying we have to look beyond its literalness. A year
Right.
and a day, German is Jahr and Tag, that, like, those are such different concepts to the ancient peoples than it is to us today. So, this is why, going back again to this whole thing, a lot of this stuff is only a few hundred years old when we think of literalism. When we
Yeah.
peel back the onion to try to find the core, the pearl, the core of the story, to me, it's so much more meaningful. And I wish that, again, people
Yeah.
would look at
Using the Bible to prove the Bible. It's like, well, yeah, because the Bible
which
says that,
one.
like, just for the hell of it, I just want to just show you this, just for, if you've
Yeah,
never seen it,
yeah,
right? I had our pastor growing up was Pastor Tessasika, a, a nice, a nice Italian guy. Past Anthony Testasica, he had type 1 diabetes, and he had early he went blind very young,
Right.
probably in his 30s. And so I think he had most of the Bible like memorized, because he couldn't read. He didn't use like read Braille or anything. So he would listen to tapes over and over and over. So I remember we did this presentation where he was the genealogy supposedly of the Messiah, and he was reciting this by memory. I couldn't. I tried to memorize some of it because you can't even really pronounce a lot of these names. But it's the
Right. Okay. A lot
genealogy
of
of
this
the
stuff. Yeah.
Messiah,
Yeah.
right? And it's
I've seen some of this before.
have you? Yeah. Blah blah blah
Yeah.
blah, all the way to Joseph, which really
Right.
technically wasn't really his father, right? Because it
Right.
was the
Right.
angel or God, and
Exactly.
all the way to that. So yeah, that's why I asked you that. It's like, is there any accuracy to this Hezekiah stuff? Uzziah and Jehoshaphat, jumping Jehoshaphat, and all, like, yeah,
See,
all
again,
the
it's
things.
so that again is a Christian interpretation. I again, there is stuff like that in, I think it's in Genesis. There's quite a bit of that
Oh
where
yeah,
someone is the son of this one who has
yeah.
this, and Rachel bequeathed this many people and whatever. So,
Mhm.
uh, what I can say to that though is that again, if we look at just DNA, we can't. I guess it's really difficult because some of these people may or may not have existed. But if we look at the DNA of the patrilineage DNA of Jewish people, there tends to be, as well as people from the Levant, have a lot of pre-Arab, meaning Levantian DNA that do trace back to people like the Canaanites and other people that, like there. So there's some DNA evidence, but again, it's not as specific as, well, Abraham gave birth to Isaac, who had his wife, and then that stuff could just be, again, the idea of patriarching. So it's like in most religions, because there's a founder in a lot of religions. Not all religions have founders. Hinduism and Shintoism doesn't, but those that have
Okay.
founders tend to patrilineage themselves, and they tend to put this hierarchy together. We see that in a lot of different religions, and some of it might not be true, but it's a way for them to sort of make them special, because basically what that's saying is that Jesus descends from Abraham. Well, if he was a Jew, I guess he probably did to some extent. I mean,
Right.
what I learned from about this later on in my life, like maybe 5, 10 years ago, was that Abraham was from Babylon, I think. So you know what I mean? Like whatever. Like,
Mm.
so yeah, they were the people who went to Babylon who were Jewish. They were once in the Levant, and so yeah, we probably all have a common ancestor. But was it actually a literal person? Who was that person? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't even know if we'll ever know. But is that the point of it? Like, I don't know. I think the point of that, by just looking at it, is just to say, well, this person, Jesus, who they would say is the Messiah, it gives him more ethos and more credibility if he descends from, from a prophet like Abraham. And you know
Right.
what? That's what people do too. That's what people do too. Like, hey, this is why you should listen to our founder, because
Mhm.
they have credibility. Well, what's their credibility? Well, this is their credibility. So I don't know. I'm just, you know, you know, what's the word? Supposing here, but
Yeah.
um, you know, but or what's that word I'm looking for? Uh, anyway, I'll get it.
I was My
Um,
mind was kind of trailing just when you were talking about
yeah,
Abraham being a prophet. I'm like, I never thought of Abraham as a prophet, but yeah, he would have been
it
because
would have
God
been.
spoke directly to him
Yeah, and he's
in the
considered a
Bible.
prophet in Islam and the Baha'i
Right.
faith, so which are other
Mhm.
Abrahamic religions.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it is what it is. Like again, it's a lot of it has to do, um, a lot of it has to do more philosophically than just, well, again, it's all true or it's all false. But anyway, regardless, the Hebrew people, the one step before them is the Canaanites, and the one step before them would be the ancient Phoenicians. And again, the very interesting point about the whole thing is what set the Hebrew people apart was their eventual migration, intellectual migration toward monotheism rather than
Okay.
polytheism. And so that's really what set us apart. So when that happens, when we talk about ethnicity, that's really when it starts to form, because everyone else were polytheists. They had all their gods, they did all those things, but this one group, like in the middle, in an island, that one island, everyone just believed in the one God, Yahweh, Hashem. I'm
Right.
not supposed to say Yahweh, but I just did. And, whatever, they all have their one God. And so then it becomes what's called an ethnic religion. And then, yeah, and then we get into, the first temple. That's when things are codified as well. And that starts, at least 1,000 or 1,200 before Common Era. I do know, as far as years are concerned, if Abraham was a historical person, he would have lived around 1,800 before Common Era, and Moses would have been around 1,200 before Common Era. And then the first temple era starts around 1,000 to 1,200 before Common Era. And
Now
the
you're saying
second
Common Era,
temple,
is that what we know as BC, like before Christ?
yeah,
Okay.
that would be BC, yeah, before
Okay,
Christ.
good.
That was before
Yeah.
Common Era, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly. And then
Gotcha.
at 586, I think it is, or 566, somewhere around there. That's when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylons come in. They destroy the first temple, and we get to the second temple era. So next is the second temple era, and that's at the end of that is where Christianity starts. So anyway, there's just if you don't mind, wouldn't mind going through some of that, if that's
Yeah.
okay, just briefly.
Yeah,
I
go
know
ahead.
we're about an hour. I don't know how
Yeah, I think
much you want to
I can
go,
go
but
another 20, 30 minutes, half hour and a
okay,
half is
perfect.
usually my
Yeah.
sweet spot.
Yeah, no, perfect. Because what I wanted to get into, so we bridge, and the next time we do this, we bridge into the ethnic groups, and we can bridge into the denominations. Is
Mhm.
that so? The Second Temple era, again, 580s before Common Era to 70 AD. So again, that overlaps with Jesus and Christianity. Is during the Second Temple era. The Second Temple would later be destroyed by the Romans.
Yep.
And we have the Western Wall, which is called the Kotel, or the Wailing Wall, which you can visit if you're in Jerusalem. I have. It's a very beautiful place. Um, what was interesting about that is they had 5 different sects, right? SECTS, that were
Mhm.
Jewish, that evolved during this era. So we had what are called the Pharisees, the
Mhm.
Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and then the early Christians that I like to call the Nazarenes. I don't know if
Nazarenes.
that's
Yeah,
actually
I
what
do
they
know
call
all those. Yes.
them. So
Yep.
basically, just to briefly go over them, because I think this is
Yep.
very, very interesting.
Yep.
So the first group was the Pharisees,
Yep.
and the Pharisees group was probably today the most influential. So they were the Jewish society had classes, just like Roman society and so forth.
Yep.
So the Pharisees were known to be the laymen, as well as the scribes of the
Mhm.
Jewish faith. So remember too, and I'm going to get into this when I talk about the Sadducees. We had priests, which is very
Yep.
that performed temple rituals. So the Pharisees were the lay people, so they were not priests, they were not ordained, and they were the ones that helped write down the oral traditions. Because after the Second Temple was destroyed, many Jews would go into places like Babylon and Alexandria, and we had to have some written record. The Pharisees accepted the oral Torah as well as the written Torah, but they resisted what was called Hellenization. And Hellenization is a process in which Greek culture, language, society, politics is introduced or
Right.
even forcibly put on someone that isn't Greek. So these Pharisees were against the adoption of Greek language and culture. And eventually, the roots of the Pharisees would go into what we call rabbinical Judaism, which I can
Yep.
talk about at another time. Rabbinical Judaism is now the foundation of Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, etc. For the Sadducees come next. They're the high priests. There also were the sect of the aristocrats and the aristocracy, as well as the merchant class. So they tended to be more upper class. They
Mhm.
rejected the oral Torah. They accepted the written Torah. They also maintained the rituals and the premises of the temple itself, and they were the ones that performed these rituals. So that was their class. They also strongly believed in Hellenization because Greek culture was
Oh.
becoming more popular at the time. And so they were fine with more introductions of Greek language and setting their structure
Oh.
up in a Greek way and so forth. And eventually, their Judaism we might call Hellenic Judaism, but it did not survive the Second Temple era. So it did not become as influential as rabbinical Judaism and the Pharisees. Okay.
I always thought of them as being sort of like together. Like one was the priesthood, the Sadducees, and then the Pharisees. I thought were like the scribes. Those are kind of what I
Sure.
learned. Um, which one of them were the? I used to learn about the phylacteries or something. There were these little boxes that they were strapped to their foreheads with like part of the law of Moses on them. No,
So
it's something in
I
the New
think,
Testament.
well,
Sadducees,
today
probably.
I don't maybe, but today there's something similar. I forget what it's called now. A tefillin. It's called a tefillin. So
Oh,
when Orthodox Jewish men go and pray, they put a strap of leather, and it has
yeah.
a box inside of
Yeah,
it.
that's a
They put on their forehead, and it's
phylactery,
a Torah, and
yeah,
then you wrap it. So I think that probably has to do with some one of them. Yeah,
interesting.
I don't really know which one, if it was Pharisees or Sadducees, but there are the Orthodox traditions who
Hmm,
they pray 3 times a day like that. So
yep,
it's
yeah,
a whole
interesting.
process. You got to wrap it around your arm, and yeah, I've only done it
Interesting,
once when
yeah.
I was in Israel, but yeah,
Oh, really? Wow, that's wild.
yeah, yeah.
Well, it is a thing,
Um,
sort of.
it is a thing still, and again, I'm not sure which one it was from though, but yeah, it's a holdover. Um, the next one was, of course, the Essenes, and these ones are my particular favorite because they're so different from what I think of the Jews today. So, first of all, the Essenes had a very strong hierarchical structure. They were considered to be very conservative, and they lived what they call an ascetic life,
Oh,
and
yeah,
they were also celibate. So that means that it kind of reminds me of monks.
yeah,
So they denied
and
themselves of worldly
eunuchs,
pleasure,
yeah,
yeah, and they didn't have sex or whatever. So to me,
mhm,
that's weird because rabbis are, if they want to, they can get married and whatever. Like it's
mhm,
totally fine. But it reminds me more of monks. So that's kind of why I like
yep,
them. They also practiced daily baptisms, and they were very mystical in their interpretation. So that's kind
interesting.
of cool. And then also, if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yep,
they were, of course, the scrolls that were found in the West Bank in the 1940s, and
yep,
they are the library of the Essene sect. So
hmm,
you could get a copy of it. I've not read it, so I don't really know the contents, but I know that they
mhm,
found it in a desert cave. It would have been thousands of years after the Essenes perished after 70 AD until 1940, so almost 2,000 years later. And anyway, they're to me they're just kind of interesting because I don't think of Jews today as having a monastic order, but they seem to be the closest that we had.
interesting.
And then
Yeah,
after that, of course, are the zealots. And if you speak English, or if English happens to be your second or third language or whatever, a zealot just means someone who's usually very enthusiastic. So
yep,
when someone has a zeal, they talk about being enthusiastic and
mhm,
whatever, and spreading what they believe in. And so the zealots were political radicals. They held a very strong sense of Jewish nationalism. And what they wanted to do was, of course, during the time of the Second Temple, the Romans were occupying Judea, which they renamed, Israel and Judea. And so the Zealots believed in resisting Roman occupation through violent means. And
mhm,
one of those groups, they had different groups. One was called the Sicarii, and they were the ones that fought at the siege of Masada between 72 and 74 CE. And you can go to Masada today. Again, I have been to Masada. If you look at the Dead Sea, it's on the southwest part of the Dead Sea. And it's a big mountaintop fortress. You can take a cable car up or you can walk, and it's beautiful. It's really amazing. And so they have that. And so that was the next group. And then the final group, which bridges into Christianity, is of course the early Christians or Nazarenes, who start with the teachings of Jesus. Baptism, of course, becomes very important.
Mhm.
He definitely was resisting Roman and Greek aspects. And there's a lot of stuff I don't know about Jesus, but I do know that the teachings of Jesus were definitely spread more by what we would call the Apostle Paul, and then eventually one of Jesus's apostles, who you call Saint Peter, would become the first pope. And so both of them were Jews. The first pope was Jewish,
Mhm.
Paul. His Hebrew name was Simon. And in my research last week for biblical literalism and criticism, I looked at all the popes. There's on Wikipedia. So I wanted to see, has there ever been another Jewish pope except for Simon or Peter? And the fifth pope, I forget his name, but Pope number 5, his father was Jewish, his mother was not. So there's been
Really?
one and a half Jewish popes in the history of the
1.5?
papacy, overwhelming Greek, overwhelming Roman, overwhelming, German, French.
Yeah.
The one guy, Pope number 5, had a Jewish father, and
Wow.
the number one head guy was Peter, and he was Jewish, or Simon. So,
Yeah.
obviously, I don't know that much about early Christianity. As I said, I really haven't read much in regard to the Christian Bible, New Testament, but there are some things, obviously, that us growing up osmosis in a predominantly Christian society, predominantly Christian culture, and having family members that are Christians, I do know that there was this idea of, what happened to Jesus,
Yeah.
there's resurrection or
The
whatever. And then
resurrection,
there's
yeah.
this,
The
yeah,
12 apostles.
and then there's the spreading of the gospel later on. Exactly.
Yeah, the upper room, that's where, the Pentecostal comes from, but
Yeah,
that was way
exactly.
later. But yeah, as far as St. Peter goes, he was um the true, like the star of the true church, which is what Catholicism, claims that they're the true church. A lot of them claim they're the true church. But
Yeah.
one thing I want to ask you about because I'm thinking this whole like things with the numbers like 12 and 7 is supposedly like a godly number.
Yeah.
12, you got the 12 tribes of Israel.
Mhm.
Judah was the oldest, right? And then you got things that we learned was like this whole thing of this holy set apart people. And even now we won't talk about Zionism, but it's a thing, right? But the Levites, I believe, were the priesthood, where
Mhm.
they were like the holy priesthood, and they would get, like, the other tribes would be like going out and buying and selling and doing all kinds of
Right.
things to get like money and goods and everything they needed, and they would have to tithe. That's kind of where it kind of started, the whole tithing thing, to
Right.
the Levites. And I'm wondering, is that like still a thing? Like, do people know like what tribe they came from, or was even that a thing with all of those 5 sects that you were talking about? Or that did
So
that kind of get lost over the years?
I have watched a lot of documentaries on the lost tribe of Israel theory, which, if you are in Ethiopia, because there are Jews in Ethiopia that converted, by the way, and also in Nigeria that later on would convert and become their own special group. Okay, there's a lot of theories on this 12th tribe, this lost tribe.
Mhm,
Um, we really don't focus on that. That seems to be much more focused in Islamic and Christian circles. I don't necessarily know why. I'm not sure.
mhm,
But I do know that a lot of the stuff, again, because I'm not as familiar with the New Testament, but there's probably a lot of things in the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, when it comes to priesthood, when it comes to rituals, when it comes to rites and what they call liturgy and whatever. I'm sure a lot of that is fairly accurate, but it's one of these lost tribe things that I don't really think that that's something we really focus on, because I don't know if that just might be just purely legend. Like, we do know, regardless of whether or not there was an Abraham or a Moses, there was a Pharisees, there was a Sadducees, there was an
mhm.
Essenes, there was a Zealot, for two main reasons. One is, in the first century, there was a very, very important Jewish historian, one of the first, probably the first Jewish historian ever, named Josephus. And a
Yeah.
lot of what I'm talking to comes from him, from
Yes.
Josephus.
Yeah.
And he collected a lot of things. Now, could the guy be wrong? Sure. But he did have some evidence. Okay. And then the second is we have to go in modern times and look at archaeology. And this is why I'm saying sometimes there are hits, sometimes there are misses. But it seems like a lot of what Josephus wrote, and his books are, of course, translated into English, they still exist. I've read a few of them being a historian, and they do seem to check out at least to some extent. So,
Mhm.
okay, could it be possible that none of this existed? Sure, but it seems like at least the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots did. We have Masada. You know what I mean? Like Masada does exist. Masada, there's the ancient weaponry. Like I've been there. They have the weaponry that's there. They have emblems from the Sakari. Like so, certain things would have existed, but it's really anyone's guess at the whole puzzle, right? So you always have to understand that like biblical archaeology is a jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces
Mhm.
yet.
Right.
So you're never going to get the full picture without all the pieces, and some of those pieces might not even exist. So I think that Josephus is pretty credible, and I think that a lot of archaeology, at least for the stuff that he was credible on, has backed that up to some extent. I can't say it's 100, I can't say it's zero, but I can definitely say that he was pretty accurate. So that's another source that I think is good for anyone who's out there, is to read about Josephus, but also to read books that have been produced later in time about Josephus, because
Mhm.
he was in the
I've
first
read some of
century,
them.
right? So
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. So I think that they're very, very fascinating, and I do think that he was pretty good. And you know what? Again, even if for some reason in the future they all get debunked or whatever, which would be a very difficult thing to do, like I say, Josephus is still someone that at least tried to form a narrative, a history of the Jewish people, which is still extremely important, regardless of how literal or non literal it is. Because when we look at history, we have multiple perspectives and multiple things to look at as well. So when we have an ethnic groups will tell themselves certain things that might be true and not. That
Right.
includes
Yeah.
Americans. American history is shrouded with mythology. Like some of
Yeah.
your founding fathers, they weren't Christians. Some of them were slave owners. Some
Right.
people don't know that. Like there's a lot.
Right.
What I'm saying is it's complicated. Is all I'm
Yeah.
saying. So
Mhm.
what's true and what isn't, I think is just is a mix of observation and then from these sources from the ancient times as well.
Absolutely. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions or comments, let me know. Just put question or comment in all caps. And I've got some things I've been starting as I go along. If you don't mind reading some comments, and I think we had a few questions. So we had Seal Bill with a little bit of a blessing. Good morning, all. May Hashem grant many. Did I say it right? Uh, many blessings to the Goldenrod Resistance and the children of Xenu. I love it.
Oh God, what a guess.
Well, you're definitely a seeker, right? Because for
Yep.
you to go from, Judaism, kind of a background in that, and you had some influences from, Christianity, right? And then become a Scientologist for a good solid 3 years or so, and then back to Judaism. It's very, very fascinating, and
Yeah, and again, if you want to go back on my channel, they're long, but I did talk to Doug about that. I can, if you want to talk about that too in future videos, I sent
yeah,
you that list
absolutely.
of certain groups that I talked with Doug. We can talk about it as
Yep.
well. So,
Yeah.
all a
That's
learning
how
process.
I found you, was through Doug's channel, and I
Yeah,
always thought it was really interesting, you going through, well, a lot of the different denominations that I heard about, but never really understood, like, where they were coming from. So it's very interesting. Like the universal,
100%.
you you know, how does this
Unitarian, yeah, Unitarian.
Unitarian
Yeah,
Universalists, and I
of
didn't
course,
know
of
that
course.
they were separate and then merged too. That's very interesting as
Yeah, two
well. So
Christian
yeah.
churches and now they're considered a totally different religion. They're not a form of Christianity anymore. But yeah, they were two Christian churches, and then they sort of did their own thing after the '60s. But yeah, they're very interesting too.
Yeah. So we got Anna from Canada. This is very interesting. I know some of this. My hubby was born in Syria. Nice.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool. That's really
that's
cool.
great. And our friend AB, Analytical Blarney, and she's from my kind of brand of Christianity back in the day. A
Oh,
little bit of culty,
ah,
a lot bit culty. He
wow.
meaning Mark is very informative and love how he's breaking this down for us. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you
Helps
so
people
much.
really understand
It's
it.
complicated, I might trip over my words every once in a while, but it's
No, no, it
complicated.
makes
What
a
can I
lot of
say?
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's a warning, mischief managed. A little late for me to read the warning, but FYI, everyone, Stacy's on pain meds and currently high AF. Please excuse any spelling errors. I have spelling errors all the time, and I don't have that
Yeah.
excuse.
I'm awful at spelling, by the way. Horrible typos.
Me
I
too.
can't stand English. I don't know why someone just doesn't invent a fully phonetic alphabet. We need it.
I know, isn't it crazy? It really
Oh,
is.
it's the
So
worst.
annoying. Super annoying. Saja says, I'm sorry with this. Oh, we're talking about Noah and all the things. I'm sorry with this stuff just makes me laugh. The Bible is poorly written book that makes little sense, and using it as history is laughable. Yeah, I'm seeing that now. Now I'm on the
Yeah.
other side of it. Skepticism runs deep. Yeah, and that's healthy, especially when you're talking about this kind of thing that you're basing your life on, and teaching your children. Yeah, it was very confusing at times, but I wasn't really allowed to ask questions. Never. Oh, we're talking about the Tower of Babel or Babel.
Mhm.
Never an
Yeah.
errand. Only God could see everyone getting along, working together, and say, "Nope, it ain't happening."
Yeah. Nope. Yeah, exactly.
Let's scramble the languages. Well, I think it was the idea of like we were always taught that God was a jealous God, and
Yeah.
our friend Doug kind of said, "Well, the God that I'm hearing about sounds a little bit narcissistic." Not to use that word. No, we don't want to throw that word around, but yeah, I was like, you know what, Doug? I think you're right. It's like
Yeah.
it's not like having like an abusive boyfriend. This is like you can only talk to me, you can only look at me, you can only me all the time. And if you don't do what I say, I'll throw you in hell and you'll burn forever and ever and ever and ever. That's not very nice. That's pretty egocentric, to say the least.
Yeah, it definitely tells you a lot about the people who would have written it. They
Yeah,
really
yeah.
wanted people to convert, so,
Fear of punishment if you don't.
yeah,
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 or else. Yeah.
exactly.
Jason says, it's still like that, in my opinion. When you grow up in a bubble of certain group, you have misconceptions of others that you don't know. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
I had no idea what was out there. I wanted to pop this up. Clearwater Chad popped in
Yeah, hey,
and
Clearwater. He's always
Mark and
on.
I
He's
are
a good supporter.
we're going through well, Buffalo, he's not really from Clearwater.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to meet him next week sometime. So yeah.
Oh, nice, okay.
That would be awesome to meet him in person.
That's so
Been
cool, yeah.
known him for like 2 years now. Stasia, most religions sound exactly the same, just the gods with different names. Yeah. Some have many gods, some have one.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anna from Canada, she's got some great comments. It's interesting. When I met my hubby, I grew up Catholic and him Muslim. He knew all the same stories I learned from the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Riddle me this though. Like, weren't the Islamic religion, wasn't it derived from Ishmael?
That's what they
I mean,
say, yeah, that's what they
okay.
believe. That's right. So
Yeah.
their whole thing is that, um, well, because they are monotheistic.
So it's the God of
Oh,
Abraham. Oh, can you hear
sorry,
me?
yeah, I'm getting, oh, yeah, I'm getting a little,
Did you freeze?
yeah. Anyway, it's all good now. I froze, but,
All right.
so, Muhammad believed that, like, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, they were prophets, as well as the prophets from the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, so like Daniel and all them,
Hmm.
Jacob, Isaiah, whatever. So his
Yeah.
thing was that he took a lot from the Bible, Old and New Testament, and then sort of put his own spin on it. And so, yeah, they do believe, I think, that he was descended also from Abraham, but also Ishmael, and there's a bunch of other things going on. So they learn all that stuff too. I mean, they have their own interpretations, but like
Right.
Muslims will read, because if they call it the book in Islam, and they also call it the people of the book. So it's according to Muslim law that if a Muslim finds themselves in a state or a nation or a country or something that is majority Jewish or majority Christian, they
Hmm.
treat it as if they are like Muslims because they come from the same source. So essentially, there's a lot of that overlap in there, and so really, Islam is a continuation, just like kind of Christianity is to some extent, from the same source, from the same stories as well.
Mhm. And I asked question, didn't Christianity start in Africa?
I don't know. I thought it maybe. I don't know. I don't really know too much about that. I know that I think there's some theories about that. There's groups like the Nation of Islam or the Black Israelites who believe that everything sort of started in Africa. So who knows? Maybe they're right.
Right. Yeah, well, the tradition that
Who knows? I don't know.
yeah, what I grew up under was, Jerusalem, that Jesus was crucified
Yeah.
and rose again after 3 days, but then the apostles scattered throughout
Yes.
the land. So that could
Yeah.
be, also true. But as far as the origins of it, it's what I've heard was that is Jerusalem. But
That's
then
correct.
they, spread out
Oh yeah,
throughout
that's how
the
you
world.
get Christianity. That's how you get Christianity in Armenia. That's how you get Christianity in Ethiopia. It's how you get it, in lots of different places, as well as the Arab world. It didn't take to some of those places, but yeah, it's through the apostles, right? So,
Hmm.
and also through the Middle East.
Yeah, I really can't argue with this too much. As it says, Stasia says that's why I see religious as mostly bad because it gives people an excuse to be awful. Well, there has been a lot of wars, a lot of
Yeah,
killing and unrest. We're seeing it today,
sure.
even. So yeah, I can't really argue with that. And forget baptism. Oh, we're talking about the perpetual
Mhm.
baptisms and one of the sects. Baptism to cleanse for original sin as we are born sinners. That's what I was taught.
Right.
Yeah. It was mostly, I think, we talk about a lot of literal things, but there were some things that were symbolic in our tradition of like baptism. I, you're really supposed to be baptized once in my, in our congregation, but I was baptized twice because I was afraid the first time didn't count. So I said the sinner's prayer a lot too. It's kind of like the people that say that they signed the Sea Org contract a bunch of times. Like how many billions of years did you sign the contract for? Like I was born again a couple of times again. And then baptism is supposed to be like an outward manifestation of an inward thing, just like with, it's like a public statement, just like with speaking in tongues is like evidence that you're baptized in the Holy Spirit. And then there's like I think some religion or some sects of Christianity or denominations like Catholicism believes that the Eucharist and the blood and the wine actually become the body and the blood of Christ. We didn't believe that. We were just Jesus said, in Matthew or I don't know what book, probably several books, that do this in the remembrance of me. So it was like more
Mhm.
of a symbolic thing that we would do once a month. But some churches do it every single week, or whatever they get together. So yeah, so that those were just some of the things that weren't literal, but most of our stuff was to be taken literal.
Yeah,
So thank you for that.
that's like again a big thing with Protestantism, right? Like Protestant, it's called transubstantiation, and Protestants
Mhm.
don't believe that. They
Mhm.
just they use it as a symbol, whereas I guess there's some idea that the priest actually performs a miracle. So
Yeah.
that I find interesting too, because again, I know a lot of Protestants, like you mentioned, they do communion, like Anglicans will, Lutherans will. Some
Yep.
don't do it, but a lot do, and yeah, it's a different interpretation. I think I don't know, hard to know.
That was one. I think that was one of the things that kind of came out of the Protestant movement. And also I think that the main thing that I learned was, with Martin Luther, one of his main issues was basically buying selling of indulgences.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That
Yeah.
yeah, that was I think one of the main issues was that
Mhm.
I think that more of the rituals that the Catholics were kind of into, like we were like, well, we're not into the law, we're into more of the spirit, and we're not in legalism, which is bullshit because I lived my life in legalism. There was so many, and my Catholic friends, a lot of them would have fun, and then they would just go and confess on. once a
Yep.
week or whatever.
Oh yes, yeah, right. Not a bad way to go. In Judaism, we have one day a year that we atone for our sins. That's on Yom Kippur, and nobody likes it because you're supposed to go to synagogue for the entire day and fast.
Ooh, yeah.
So, but then we're kind of absolved for the year, so it's not too bad for us, I guess. I
Jeez.
don't know.
God, at Door of
It's
Hope, we
not a
fasted
fun
all
time.
the time. That's like the F word in my vocabulary.
God,
Fasting.
fasting. Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is so much fun. Thank you so much. This is great. I
Of
mean,
course, of
I
course.
always love talking to you. Very fascinating. And yeah, let's do this again soon.
Yeah, because I'd
Okay.
like to go into rabbinical Judaism and then go into the denominations and
Yeah.
specifically go to the actual ethnic groups, which I think will be fun.
Oh,
But yeah,
absolutely.
another time, I will contact if you could do it whenever. It's
Yeah,
all
thanks.
good.
Yeah, let's
I'm
definitely check
I'm
our
around.
schedules and yeah, well, thank
Yeah,
you everybody for being here. If you're in the chat and you want to hit the like and subscribe if you haven't subscribed, that's great. If you're watching on the replay, send us a note. I read all the comments. I'll let Mark know if there's any directed towards him. Like and subscribe over at Mark's channel. It's at Mark
thank you.
Turi 123. And yeah, let's get you some more subscribers. And thanks a lot. And so I will play the outro and we will talk soon.
Yeah.
Bye,
Take
everybody.
care, everyone.
Zenu, Marlene, everybody partake. Cheers. This is good coffee. This is why, my hubby makes the coffee.